Atul Khanna, first book writer, book called Between You and Me. Very good read. I've been reading bits of it. And New India Reality Reloaded by Gurjot Kalar, unusual police officer, serving police officer, very young police officer. He was here yesterday and the day before. I'm not sure whether he's here today, but I'd just like to acknowledge two budding new writers. Thank you.
Rebel Sultans and their Begums. Going south, Manu Pillai and Ira Mukhoty will discuss the rise of Empress Queens and Begums of the Mughal Empire and intrigues from the Deccan Kingdom. We have Manu Pillai, award-winning author of The Ivory Throne, discussing his book Rebel Sultans, The Deccan from Khilji to Shivaji. Ira is the author of Heroines, Powerful Indian Women of Myth and History, and Daughters of the Sun, Empresses, Queens and Begums of the Mughal Empire. She has a keen interest in the evolution of mythology and history and its relevance to the status of women in India. Fits in very well with taking forward the concept of Nari Shakti.
Good afternoon, everybody. We have a lot of information to go through with Manu's wonderful new book, Rebel Sultans. So I'll just give you a short introduction. This is an exciting time to be writing narrative history in India. Just in this literary festival, I've been here for 3 days, and I've heard Kishore Desai's amazing talk on 1919 Jallianwala Bagh, massacre, reimagined with new documents, where she tells us that it wasn't just the act of one crazy man, Dwyer, but this was a pogrom carried out by the British of humiliation against the people of Ludhiana. And then Seema Anand's wonderful book on desire in Indian women and how she has managed to recapture its nuances through the oral text. And I think Ian Magadar, who spoke about Indian Videshi, which was fascinating as well. So, we are rediscovering our history after many, many decades. We are sort of getting away from the shackles of a colonial interpretation and starting to reimagine different ways of being Indian, different ways of seeing Indian history. Historiography itself is changing in India. For a long time, we were told that India is an ahistorical place. We have no sense of history. But that was really because they were comparing us with the Western way of seeing it in a linear way, a narrative which moves forward in time, and also a written history, whereas we have more of an oral history, which is just as relevant. And now we are beginning to understand that and incorporate that into our histories as well. So narrative history is something that is becoming very exciting. Now, we have always known all these things amongst the academics. The academics have always brought out wonderful work in India, but somehow it has stayed within that closed circle of academia. Now, for the past few years, we are finding narrative history written for a wider audience, and that's very exciting because this is getting this out to lay people who are able to imagine history in new and different ways. One of the exciting new writers in narrative history is Manu Pillai, sitting here. Now, he may be exciting, but he is hardly new, because from the age of 19, when the rest of us were struggling with managing laundry for the first time in college or making a grilled cheese sandwich without burning down the kitchen, he was calmly going ahead and gathering information for his first book, which he completed at the age of 25 and for which he won the Sahitya Kala Puraskar. So, The Ivory Throne. So, a very intimidating writer to be sitting next to, and someone who makes every other writer feel somehow inferior and as if we have wasted our lives all this time. The book we are talking about today is Rebel Sultans, and we will be talking about their Begums as well. But I want Manu first to tell us why he chose narrative history as a young writer and why Rebel Sultans, because most of history in India is very north-centric. It's in fact very Delhi-centric, and we hear a lot about those stories, but very, very rarely about the Deccans beyond Shivaji, perhaps the Marathas, this fight with Aurangzeb, and perhaps Vijayanagar. But beyond these few facts, there's very little that we know about the Deccan. So Manu, why narrative history and why Rebel Sultans?
Well, simply because there are so many stories in a country like ours. And one of the tragedies of history in our country is that we often succumb to this temptation to reduce it to black and white. Whereas in reality, as we were discussing last Monday when Ira and I did another event in Delhi, Indian history is much more a mosaic of colors, and they come together and give you a beautiful picture, which is what represents us much better than these black and white Hindu-Muslim narratives that dominate not only textbooks and general conversations these days, but even our imagination. Now, you mentioned North-centric, for example. I come from the South, and the difference is, if you look at history only from a North-centric perspective, you get one interpretation of it, but if you turn your gaze towards the South, you discover that the same thing can be interpreted in a different way. Now, Islam, for example, everybody says Islam came to India with the sword when, the invaders came to the Sindh and so on. Sure, that is true for the North, perhaps. But I come from Kerala, where, Islam came through peaceful embassies of commerce in the lifetime of the Prophet himself. The oldest mosque in India, which is supposed to be one of the oldest mosques in the world, legend says that it was built in the lifetime of the Prophet, a year before the Prophet died, in a place in Kerala called Kodungalur. Now, even if the mosque wasn't built then, even if this is merely a legend, 200 years later, by the 800s, by the 9th century, you already have Arabic signatures of Muslims witnessing royal grants in Kerala. Now, the North culturally has often more in common with Kabul and Afghanistan than it has with the South. Kerala has more in common with Arabia than it has with the North. One of our oldest legends in Kerala is about a king who converts to Islam and goes off to Arabia. This king also apparently witnessed the Prophet splitting the moon. So you start going into these stories and you discover that history in India is so much more than these bare bones that we are taught in school and taught in our textbooks. The other thing is even these questions of who is an Indian and who is not, who is an insider, who doesn't belong, and so on. So recently on Twitter, this Twitter school of history says that, all the Mughals, they came from outside, they're all foreigners. Okay, that's an interesting yardstick, that they came from outside and therefore they don't belong. But let's go to the South, where you go to the 8th century and you have this very Hindu-sounding name, Nandi Varman II, who was a Pallava emperor. The irony was this Pallava emperor was born in Vietnam. The thing is, one fine morning, the Pallava emperor in Kanchipuram dies, and the Brahmins at court realize he doesn't have a son, there's no heir. How do you find the next emperor? Now they discover a brother of his had gone off to Vietnam. Again, a testament to the kind of maritime links the South had, which the North did not. And the Brahmins get on a boat, go all the way to Vietnam, and discover a descendant of this prince who married into this Vietnamese royal family, this 12-year-old boy, and they import him from Vietnam and install him as emperor in Kanchipuram with the Southeast Asian features and so on. So if you're saying the Mughals came from outside, well, so did a Pallava emperor, who then continued the dynasty and spawned heirs and so on. History, therefore, has so many stories. Now, this book is about the Deccan. In the front, you can see a man on the elephant. On the back, you can see another man sitting on the elephant who is a black man. Now, I grew up in Maharashtra, where we are never taught very much beyond Shivaji. Shivaji has his place, he deserves that place. But the irony is that this image encapsulates a moment that doesn't quite receive the importance it should. How many Maharashtrians know that in a place like Ahmednagar, which is now a tier 2 town, there were thousands of Africans who came year after year, joined armies, became Peshwas, which is, the very word Peshwa, by the way, is Persian. The Chief Minister of Maharashtra, Devendra Fadnavis, his surname Fadnavis is a Persian word. Persians came, Africans came. There were at least 2 sultans in Ahmednagar who had black queens. And this is all in the early 17th century, late 16th century. We never learned these things. The guy sitting on the elephant up front is the Adil Shah of Bijapur. Now you can look at him as a Sunni Muslim, but he also styled himself son of Guru Ganapati and the pure Saraswati, because he saw no irony or no contradiction in wearing Rudraksha beads, in painting his nails red and calling himself a devotee of Saraswati, to the extent that he wanted to rename Bijapur Vidyapur to honor the goddess. He had a painting made of Saraswati where if you look at it at one glance, it looks like a Muslim princess. You know, her costume, her clothes, everything. She looks like a Muslim princess. But look closely, there's the lotus, there's the veena, there's the conch. It's Saraswati painted through Muslim eyes. You have Muntoji Bahmani, who is a descendant of the Bahmani Sultans, and he wants to become, he's a Bhakti saint from Tukaram's time, I think, and he wants to become Mrityunjaya, wear the sacred thread and become a Hindu, and the Brahmins say no. So there's so much give and take. Of course there was bigotry, of course there was violence, of course temples were destroyed, of course mosques were also destroyed, but it wasn't a story of black and white. You mentioned Vijayanagar as well. There's this historic battle of Talikota that trolls on Twitter always pull up saying, oh look, the last Hindu empire was demolished and destroyed by Muslims in 1565. Again, look closely at the details of this battlefield. The emperor of Vijayanagar, who's leading his troops into the battle of Talikota, he began his career working with a Muslim sultan called the Qutub Shah of Golconda. The Qutub Shah of Golconda began his career, his teenage years, 7 years he lived in Vijayanagar, where he learned the Telugu language, Teluguized his name from Ibrahim to Malik Brahma, married a Telugu woman, and went back and patronized poetry on the Mahabharata. At the Battle of Talikota were 6,000 Marathas fighting, but they were fighting for the Muslim sultans. There was a famous general called Ainul-Mulk Gilani who was fighting for the Hindu emperor of Vijayanagar. So, as you look at details, you find that none of these black and whiteizations of Indian history make any sense. They don't belong in, they shouldn't receive the kind of attention we give them, and we should scrape beneath the surface because there's so much more.
I warned you there was a lot to talk about in this book. Now,
I must apologize for speaking so fast. The timer is here, and I realize we only have 15 minutes.
So. We have a lot to get through. So in my defense as representative of the North Indian history, I have to say that Islam also came to the north through Sufis, so not always at the end of a sword. Now to talk about the Begums, since the title is the Begums as well. One of the few characters that impinge upon northern consciousness apart from Malik Ambar is Chand Bibi. So can you tell us a little bit about her rise, where she came from and what she accomplished?
Begums are always a little more complicated because women, A, history was always written by the men. B, where there were Begums, they're often written out of history or they're reduced again to beautiful or valorous or, these monochromatic characters. Chand Bibi is remembered because she led the resistance against the Mughals in Ahmednagar. As a result, she ended up being assassinated, so there's a sort of romance to her story. For that reason, even the Mughals remembered her, and therefore her story survives to a great extent. But more than Chand Bibi, what interested me was her mother, Kunza Humayun, who's frankly only a footnote in the book, but my column in Mint next week is about Kunza. And this woman is much more interesting because she didn't die at the end of a sword, so there's no romance to her death, and therefore you can't sort of put her up in poetry and sort of idealize her and leave her there. She was a woman of flesh and blood who had ambition. She wasn't great at foreign policy. She was ruthless when it came to power, and that is what makes her more interesting. To the extent that she was regent for her son, and when the son came of age, she wouldn't give up power. And eventually the nobles had to gang up and push her and sort of put an end to this so-called petticoat government. Her son came to hate her so much that there's this poem that she commissioned in which there are these beautiful illustrations of her with her husband, very inspired by Hindu iconography and painting, because in one painting, for example, she's sitting in the lap of her husband. And normally these women weren't painted as they were, but this woman was. And her son was so upset, he had her painted over. So in many of these illustrations and manuscripts, you find that she's been reduced to this massive blob or a little bit of a smudge because her son wasn't happy with the kind of place she'd earned for herself in history. And she then rotted away in jail, so there were no poets to sing about her. There were no people to sort of turn her into some sort of stoic, tragic heroine, and then that was the end of her story. The only one interesting record of her is from the Portuguese, who again decided to give it their own little Orientalist twist, where they said, oh, she was a Devadasi who got married to the Sultan and then sort of seduced him and then murdered him and all of that, which was all false. She was a Persian woman who had come off, her father had come off to India. I was mentioning the Adil Shahis, to whom she was related. She was married to one of the Adil Shahs of Bijapur. Again, you look at them as Muslims, as a Muslim sultanate. The first Adil Shah, Yusuf, comes from Persia. Somewhere on the boat, he decides that he's going to concoct a genealogy for himself. So by the time he lands in the Deccan, he says, oh, I'm a long-lost son of the Ottoman Sultan. Then he marries a Maratha noblewoman, and they spawn a dynasty together. So it's not just Muslim, it's part Persian, part Hindu, part Maratha. So you have the next Adil Shah, the second Adil Shah, who favors the Persian side of his family. So he wants his soldiers dressed in Persian costume, he speaks only Persian, etc. But by the time you have Ibrahim Adil Shah II, who is pretty much the Akbar of the Deccan, you find that he prefers Marathi. He prefers patronizing Indian languages. He prefers Indian gods, so much so that when the Mughal ambassador comes, he's horrified to find that the Adil Shah is not particularly comfortable in Persian. He, like Akbar built his Fatehpur Sikri, he builds up a city of his own, full of artists and so on. And you have travelers coming there and leaving accounts of how he's surrounded by, one saw him sitting in a gathering of 500 women, all of them playing the veena. Another time he's gone out to an outdoor theater where he's watching an elephant match. He garlands all his visitors, Vijayanagar, which his uncle destroys in 1565, you go there even now and you find that there are sculptures that show Arabs leading horses in presents to the Vijayanagar emperor. They're dancing for the Vijayanagar emperor. In the Vittala temple, there's a column featuring a Turkish or an Arab warrior on a horse. This is a Muslim inside a Hindu temple. In Srirangam, which is not part of the book, but another story that tells you a lot about history, in Srirangam there's a deity called Tulukanachia. Tuluka is a Tamilization of Tughlaq or Muslim. The story goes that after one of these wars, one of the Tughlaq sultans took up the idol from Srirangam and took it to Delhi, and then a delegation of Brahmins went up and finally sort of appealed to him and said, please give us our god back. And he says, fine, I'll give you your god back. But then they discover that the sultan's daughter has started to play with the deity as though it's a doll. And she starts, bathing him and dressing him and garlanding him and so on, which is essentially what you do in Hindu rituals. So when the idol is given back to the Hindus and it's taken back to South India, she's heartbroken because she wakes up from her sleep and discovers that the idol's gone. So she chases the idol all the way back to Srirangam and then dies tragically over there when she discovers that her beloved deity has been re-enshrined inside the temple. And she is now consecrated in the temple as well, where the prasad is chapati, and where when the deity comes there, he's dressed in sort of North Indian Islamic clothes, even today. And this is a Hindu temple. So, as I said, the layers and layers and layers of Indian history, they're so rich, they're so complicated, that to reduce them to these boring, annoying, black and white Hindu-Muslim arguments that you see today is a tragedy. And books like mine and Ira's are essentially trying to counter that and say that, look, our history is much richer, it's much more interesting, and we're doing ourselves a disservice by making it about these narrow, boring issues.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Manu. Very interesting what you said about the mother of Chand Bibi, that she didn't die in battle, so she's not consecrated in the same way. In the north it's happened exactly the same way with Rani Lakshmibai. She's only remembered as a warrior who died in battle, whereas she did so much more. I would like to talk a little bit about Firoz Shah Bahmani and his harem. He's a fascinating figure for me because he's the exact contemporary of Timur the Name, and he sets himself up to emulate the Timurid, legacy, much as Babur did 100 years later. So tell us a little. I want to just read a few lines about his harem, which seems absolutely fascinating. Nothing, however, could surpass Firoz Shah's harem, which came to include women from Russia, China, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, and it was rumored that he conversed in bits and pieces, at any rate, with each of them in her own tongue. So tell us a bit about this unorthodox harem and what influence, if any, they may have had, and Firoz Shah himself.
Firoz Shah Bahmani was one of the more colorful Bahmani sultans, and not only did he have Central Asian and Russian and Mongoloid and all wives from all these places, he also married a Vijayanagar princess. And you mentioned Timurid influence in his court, but the other influence that was there was South Indian, because when he married this Vijayanagar princess, one of his demands was that it was at the end of a battle, so it was a political alliance. So at the end of it, he said, I want mountains of gold and I want rubies and diamonds, but I also want 2,000 artists, painters, dancers, musicians, all of these people. He wanted to essentially consciously import South Indian Vijayanagar culture into the Bahmani capital and use that to build up a new form of architecture to influence art and culture and so on. In fact, other than the section you read, there's a footnote where there's this anecdote from a traveler who talks about how Firoz Shah Bahmani had different palaces for each of his wives. So if he had a wife from Arabia, it was called Arbi Mahal, where all the servants, all the staff, they would all be Arabs as well. So when he went there, he could practice speaking Arabic. Then he go to some South Indian wife and practice the South Indian tongue over there. So he was this very, very charismatic, colorful figure who again dominated Deccan history for a very long and successful reign. And that's the other thing about what I'm trying with this book, which is that you make history about the people who shaped it and you get a completely different perspective. We have a tendency again to reduce history to these bare bones of dates, battles, this happened and then that happened. I don't blame textbook writers for it because it's such a rich and complicated and diverse country that to try and encapsulate all of that in 50 pages for a school student is not easy. But with books like ours, what you're trying to do is remind people that though their context may have been different, the people who shaped history, our mistake is we always think of them as different. Their core impulses were just like us. They weren't somehow different creatures. They were human. They had their weaknesses. They had their prejudices. They had sex. They went to the toilet. They fought battles and had similar issues that we face even today. So if you make it about their stories, you start connecting to them much better. And through their eyes, you get to see their time in all its richness, with all its colors and all its detail. The more you alienate history from its people, the more you make it difficult to understand. Whereas if you make history about its people, you start connecting practically on a human level. And then you discover, for example, that even Mahmud Ghor, for example, Mahmud Ghori, everyone says he came and destroyed temples, and you have texts that say, oh, he's killed 20,000 infidels and so on. Now this is a text. It's a Persian or an Arabic text that he's writing to suck up to his friends in Arabia and Turkey and, in the Middle East, because he wants them to think that, look, I'm being such a good Muslim here in the land of the infidels. But reality was, this man had to deal with the infidels. They had to collect his taxes, they had to pay him taxes, and he had to rule over them. So the same Mahmud Ghori, who claims to have killed thousands of infidels, his coins have Lakshmi nicely inscribed on them. He has Sanskrit characters inscribed on them. The early Delhi Sultanate coins, you find that on the one side you have their Arabic inscriptions, on the other side you have Sanskrit. Vijayanagar, again painted always as a Hindu empire, as early as 1352, one of their most glamorous titles, which they used for 250 years, was Hindu Raya Suratrana, sultans among Hindu kings. Even the Vijayanagar emperors wanted to call themselves sultans. One of them went to the extent of calling himself Gola Suratrana, which is sultan of the world. And they weren't alone. There was a ruler of Andhra Pradesh who called himself Andhra Suratrana. The ruler of Bengal, when he went into Nepal, he was called a Suratrana. Suratrana was a Sanskritization of sultan. The very word sultan came to mean something so powerful and attractive that Hindu kings had no issues appropriating it. Earlier I was talking to somebody about Shivaji, and that's another character in the book right at the end. Shivaji, everybody paints as this big warrior for Hinduism, a man who restored Hindu pride. Yes, he was looking at power through a Hindu lens. His vocabulary was inspired by Sanskritic terms, but even his story is complicated. Shivaji's father was a man called Shahji. Why was he named Shahji? Shahji's parents didn't have kids for a very long time, so they went to a Muslim saint called Shah Sharif, and he blessed them, and they finally had two sons. The firstborn was named Shahji, the secondborn was named Sharifji. Shivaji patronized this poem called the Shiva Bharata. It was commissioned by him. And this is a Sanskrit poem. So on the one hand, you have things like Shivaji's, Vishnu reborn to deliver the earth from the clutches of the Muslims. But the same poem describes the Nizam Shah of Ahmednagar as a Dharmatma. Malik Amba, this Muslim African general, is called as brave as the sun. When Afzal Khan, this is a very well-known episode where Afzal Khan is sent out to kill Shivaji, and Shivaji ends up killing him. Afzal Khan, the names coming with Afzal Khan, Ghatke, Ghorpade, these are Maharashtrian Marathi Hindu names. On Shivaji's side you have Siddhi Ibrahim. So even Shivaji, even when he was articulating a Sanskritic Hinduized vision for society, which he did, even he had to reconcile to the fact that the society in which he was living was much more complex, was much more, there's much more give and take, even in his own court, even in the culture that he spawned. As I said, the very word Peshwa, the Peshwas of Pune were Brahmins who ruled, but Peshwa is a Persian word. And again, there's no contradiction, because unlike us, people who actually lived in those times did not reduce themselves to these narrow boxes into which they fit, and they said, oh, this is us and you're something else and don't come near me.
I think we may have time for a last question. Since we are talking about Vijayanagar, the 5 rebel sultanates who had been trying in different ways through different centuries to bring down Vijayanagar finally got together through a flurry of marriages between their different houses. How important was that, do you think, the marriages? How important was the system of giving your daughter in marriage and binding another kingdom to yourself?
It was something that was used not only in India but around the world. One of my favorite stories is where Catherine de Medici marries into the French royal family, and it's a political alliance. And the funny thing is, in the European system, unless a marriage is consummated, the marriage hasn't happened, even though the rituals have happened. So poor Catherine de Medici had to make love to her husband on the evening of her wedding with her father-in-law watching, who then sent a letter to her family saying, yes, the marriage was consummated and I was witness to it. So marriages were political events. When Chand Bibi was married to, it was part of the Vijayanagar alliance, the Chand Bibi was given in marriage to the Adil Shah. There was an Adil Shahi princess who came to this side, the Qutub Shah gave a bride. But it wasn't only these sultanates. One of the Adil Shahi candidates failed to claim the throne and went off into exile in Goa, where he was negotiating for his daughter marital alliances not only with the Nizam Shah of Ahmednagar, who by the way is descended from a Brahmin converted to Islam, but also with the Vijayanagar emperor, because he saw no difference between the fact that one was a Hindu and the other was a Muslim. The daughter was merely a conduit to political power in this situation. As it happened, the daughter decided to become friends with a Christian lady who decided to come and talk to her about the Bible. And one fine Sunday morning, while her poor father is sitting and trying to negotiate alliances with these neighboring rulers, the Portuguese governor shows up with a huge crowd of women, and they physically lift this woman who wants to become a Christian, take her away with her servants, and essentially convert her to Christianity, where this family then spawns a line of Christians who convert their ancestors named Mia Ali to Mila and become, Portuguese subjects.
So I think maybe time for a few questions. quickly before the next session. The gentleman there in the middle.
Who, sorry? Oh, the Russian. Yeah, he came, he was a traveler. He had a very bad time in India because all his goods kept getting stolen and he kept getting cheated by everybody. So by the time he got to the capital of the Sultans, he said, well, this is a horrible city. There are 14 feet long snakes in the streets. The women are all harlots and black and this and that. But when he finally got to the palace, even he was stunned by the kind of splendor and wealth and prosperity he could see. He was merely one of very many travelers who came to this area and found themselves completely bedazzled, as well as shocked often by the kind of things they saw. You also find, for example, another traveler, a Dutchman, I think, who found that kids as old as 8 were smoking tobacco outside the Qutub Shah of Golconda's capital. And this is in the early 17th century. So travelers' accounts are interesting. Nikitin was one of many. He traveled a fair distance, not only in the Sultanates, but also further south, I think. But he appears in the book. Not very much, but here and there some of his choicest quotes I've used to sort of reflect on how foreigners viewed this space.
One more question, I think. Surely, after all this information. Right here in the...
Do you think you should next tackle the Begums of Bhopal?
Someone's already tackled the Begums of Bhopal in a very good book. It was written a number of years ago, but it is a very good book. It was written by a descendant who now lives in Pakistan, I think, a diplomat.
Shahri.
Yes. Okay. And he's done a very good job of the story of the Begums of Bhopal.
You should build on that.
Maybe.
It's a very slim book.
It is a slim book. Yeah. But my first book was about two very powerful women. The Ivory Throne was about Travancore's last Maharanis who essentially inherited their position because they were women. It was a matrilineal system. So I'll end on this little detail about them, which was that in the matrilineal system, your husband doesn't matter. It's your mother who matters and your uncle who matters, your maternal uncle. So the husband was only called the consort. The husband was not allowed to sit in the presence of his wife. He always had to stand unless he was invited to sit down. He could never refer to his wife by name. The husband could only call his wife Your Highness. At feasts and banquets in the palace, when the Maharani was served 4 desserts, her husband was served 2. And when the husbands died, they were not allowed to die in the palace because although they were married to the Maharanis, they were their subjects. So their entire, with the court, the person would be lifted out and taken to die in his own family, in a family house, where the Maharani and her kids would not even attend the husband's funeral. And in the 1910s...
Now you tell us, Manu, you should have started.
The height of scandal was when the Maharani of Travancore started driving in the same car with her husband, and her uncle, the Maharaja, disapproved. He said, how on earth can you travel with your husband in the same car? He can't sit next to you. He may sit, if he must sit opposite you, never next to you. So, as I said, Indian history has so many fascinating stories, and we owe it to ourselves to sort of dig deeper and find these stories. And thanks, Ira, for moderating the session.
Thank you, Manu.
You for being patient.
Please buy the book, Sultans. It's available here.
And the Ivory Throne.